When you're playing any gacha game, there are many ways that a company can try to retain your attention. If you're a more casual player, you might enjoy coming back every patch for the new story content and seeing the lore develop. If your game is an open world, maybe you'll spend time collecting chests and completing puzzles. Maybe you want to log in and just look at the pretty characters. But things like these don't last forever, and eventually you're going to reach a point where you may feel like there's nothing to do. And that's where endgame content comes in. Endgame content is something that is crucial for maintaining player retention, as well as giving your players an avenue to put their investments, whether that be time, luck, or money, to the test in a more challenging environment. But before we can go into the endgame modes themselves, we need to establish what endgame actually is. Endgame content is used as a tool to give players a reason to continue playing the game and feel like their investments were worth it. Typically, the formula consists of a mode resetting every so often, with constraints of either a timer or another form of limit between you and the max rewards. The intent is to create something that you will keep coming back to every patch, and I would say that everything we're going to talk about today technically does accomplish that. But does that mean it's good endgame? Well, sit back and get comfortable because this is going to be a long one. Starting off with Genshin Impact, for the longest time it only had one form of endgame content, that being the Spiral Abyss. The concept of Spiral Abyss is very simple. You bring in 2 teams of 4 and fight a predetermined list of enemies. Each abyss has a set abyssal moon blessing, as well as a buff on the specific floor. You can select one of 3 additional buffs per chamber, and then you try to beat the floor in under 3 minutes. And this is the formula that has been used for nearly 5 years, but it not really feeling like true endgame would become a common piece of criticism. Back in the early days of Sumeru, a GameSpot article with Hoyoverse dropped regarding the future of Genshin Impact, and in this article, we got a deeper insight on the thought process behind their idea of endgame content. When asked if we would get more endgame content similar to Spiral Abyss, Hoyoverse responded by saying, "The Spiral Abyss is one of the most effective ways for players to test out their party composition and combat strength. If we design another type of permanent endgame that is similar to the Spiral Abyss, it might end up creating excessive anxiety for our players. Not everyone is interested in Musgrief." Just like the Genius Invocation TCG that was unveiled in the special program for version 3.2, we are also working on designing more interesting gameplay in the future. As an open world game, Genshin Impact has a natural compatibility with various types of gameplay, which gives us confidence in the long-term operation. Now this says that they did not plan to develop any endgame similar to Abyss, but that doesn't necessarily mean any endgame. After this interview dropped, there are many people expressing their disappointment over what was said, as they wanted harder content, and the phrase excessive anxiety became a running joke for years. Genshin's focus has always seemingly been on exploration and the story, so meaningful endgame content didn't seem like a priority, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist. I've seen people say that Genshin Impact doesn't add significant endgame because it's a casual game, and this is such an odd take to me given the fact that Genshin's combat system has been heavily praised over the years. Endgame by nature is not made for everyone. It's for people who want to tackle the hardest content the game has to offer. Someone shouldn't be able to walk up with the team that they got 2 weeks ago and clear the content. It's supposed to be a more long-term goal. Once you finish what the game has to offer, you really aren't left with much besides waiting for the modes to reset. It's unfortunate too. People want to have a place to put their units to the test, and while Abyss can help fulfill that to some extent, it's not necessarily what people have been asking for. Spiral Abyss has gone through a variety of changes over the years, and especially given the recent decisions, it's been a pretty big topic of criticism across the community. In Sumeru, the release of Genjiro added an easily accessible reaction in the form of Hyperbloom, which basically let anyone clear with very low investment. The Sumeru patch cycle was also home to one of the most infamous Abyss rotations, 3.7. Now if we just look at the HP, it doesn't seem that bad at a first glance by today's standards. However, the enemies behind it is what made it very annoying. The elemental shields on the enemies were a massive issue on multiple chambers. The reason I bring this up is because HP isn't the only factor when it comes to the endgame. A rotation that is handcrafted to ruin your day can be equally as challenging, if not more challenging, than HP inflation. Throughout Fontaine, instead of a really massive HP spike, they seem to take a shift in enemies and bosses that just kill you faster instead. The robot boss of Coppelia and Coppelius was used 5 times across the 4.x patch cycle, but we also had the release of the new Fontaine DPSs who are marginally stronger than what we had before. And with the release of Farina, a character who everybody benefits from, made the entire roster stronger. And obviously there were still difficult abysses here and there, but it was manageable for the most part. And then there was Natlin. This is where things really started to ramp up. Now, the HP inflation has gotten a little bit out of hand, but there are a few possible reasons why HP went up so significantly. Firstly, they brought back fuller 12 leyline buffs in 5.3, coincidentally right when a certain character dropped. They were absent from the game for a very long time, so it was nice to finally see them return. We've also had more bosses who damage themselves when a certain condition is met. For example, the gluttonous Yumkasor Mountain King has a mechanic of when you break his flowers with Pyro, it'll deal some damage to him. When you climb up and break the pillars on the Secret Source Automaton, it will do some damage and drop his resistance. And towards the end of Fontaine and heading into Natlin, they also started splitting more enemies into waves. Now floors with multiple waves aren't anything new, but they were almost always done only with deletes. What the newer abysses would do is they would put elites on the first wave and then a full-on boss on the second wave. I actually don't really think this is a problem when it's done not for the sole reason of taking up time. For example, splitting 2 ruin enemies isn't necessary at all, because they're pretty much only there to waste time, given the fact both of their HP pools aren't that high to begin with. And another reason is that the damage ceiling has simply gone up. The Natlan era DPSs are getting a lot stronger, and especially a character like Mawika, who is just one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen in a video game. Genshin has indeed been power creeping as of late, and it's getting a bit ridiculous. But do all of these factors excuse HP inflation? Definitely not, so let's explain why that is. So you know how I just mentioned that leyline buffs returned? Well, that is true, but the problem is the buffs can be very hyper-specific. This is in direct contrast to the Blessing of the Abyssal Moon, which tends to have a much more general buff. The current Abyssal Moon simply wants you to do cryo damage. So let's take a look at the current leyline buff. When characters have 0 energy, damage plus 75%. As a 5.7, there's a grand total of 2 characters who don't use energy, Mawika and Skirk. They are the only 2 units in all of Genshin Impact who can fully utilize this buff. I don't really have a massive issue with shilling per se, but I have an issue when other characters are completely locked out of using the shield mechanics. Like I just mentioned, the Abyssal Moon buffs are very universal and actually a nice addition. And while I know these buffs are supposed to be smaller, they really should not be this niche. To fix this, they can simply loosen the buffs a bit, or they can give us the option to choose a buff. For example, maybe before you start an Abyss floor, you can pick between an HP buff, a buff to certain reactions, and then a buff to 0 energy. These are very minor things, but still do help you out regardless of who you own, unlike the buffs to 0 energy. When it comes to the actual bosses themselves, they are getting pretty damn tanky. For example, in 5.x, the Yumkasaur had a little under 3 million HP, but now it's up to over 5 million HP. And as somebody who does have pretty high investment characters for the most part, even I'm starting to feel my runs taking longer. Now, that's not me saying I struggle, I don't. But it's definitely getting to the point where the endgame is becoming more and more frustrating to clear, especially without the newer characters. One of the common proposed solutions is to simply add more mechanics, and that is a good idea, and they have, but they all feel slow, stally, or just not super engaging. Something like breaking the Night Soul Shield, or climbing the pillars on the Secret Source Automaton. And I'm sorry, if you need a guide to climb a rock in Genshin Impact,
then I feel like you've lost the plot.
And you know, I hate saying this shit over and over again, but a lot of these issues stem from Natlan. And I really want to like this region, because this could actually be really cool and innovative if it was done well, but instead it's just not that. I think the problem is Genshin Impact struggles to find a middle ground on things. I think that HP increasing is needed to some degree, but it needs to be balanced out with more accessible, unique mechanics. We know Genshin is capable of making unique combat quirks, new boss mechanics are featured very often in events, and even on local legends. Did you know that there was a local legend in Natlan that you're able to parry? I didn't even know this until I did research for this video. Small things like that can deepen the combat experience, but Genshin just fails to acknowledge it. Now, are they going to change anything? Probably not. They want to sell those banners, and those shield buffs and gimmicks absolutely do make them money. I don't really see this mode changing much, and this is why. It has been for the longest time a solid way to test out your characters. It was not too difficult and gave pretty good rewards, and given how bad the pull count is recently, having that is ever more important. For the truly hard content, it seems like this is going to be relegated to the new endgame mode that we're going to talk about later. So we were stuck with only Spiral Abyss for a while, until a little over a year ago where we got the release of the Imaginarium Theater. This mode ended up replacing Spiral Abyss on the 2-week rotation, so expectations for this mode were high.
And I've got to say, in all honesty, it's the biggest piece of dog shit.
Assuming the hardest difficulty, to even start you pick at least 22 characters over level 70 and up to 26, with 6 trial characters and 1 that you can borrow from a friend. But there's a catch, you can only select characters from 3 different elements, and the only characters you can pick who do not match those elements are a handful of special guest stars. While I think it does help incentivize late game players to not only own a wide variety of characters but to also build them completely, this still causes a couple of issues. First, some elements are simply stronger than others. Hydro is pretty much universally agreed upon to be the best element in the game, but it lacks very many accessible options, let alone good ones. Some elements like Dendro and Geo just have less characters. Your experience here will greatly vary depending on if you have enough characters and decent ones of the specific element or not. And this greatly impacts characters with limited team options. A character like Chevreuse wants to be played with Pyro and Electro teammates because she's an overload character. If for whatever reason you fail to meet that requirement, then she just loses all her value. And this will become a bigger issue with the release of Skirk, who always needs to be played on a freeze team. The inflexibility of certain units can cause massive issues, especially because you are required to run 4 characters on a team. And it also really decentralizes vertical investment. Now granted, Genshin is easy enough to the point where vertical investment isn't needed on most characters, But if you do have a few that you hyper-invest into, you're going to have a more annoying run. And if the element of your hyper-invested unit doesn't match this rotation's elements, then you're just shit out of luck. As for the actual gameplay, you select different random buffs to make a team, but you only get 2 Vigor points per character, meaning you can use each character twice before you can't anymore. I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing, but it feels a bit weird when doing the easiest stage and the hardest stage both cost the same amount of points. I actually think the concept of this mode is pretty good, a mode where you can take all the characters you build over time and put them to the test. It's supposed to make you think and adapt, but it still feels very contradictory to what Genshin Impact actually is. The whole point of Genshin Impact is to build teams and create reactions, but this mode is mashing 4 units with decent no synergy together and praying that you can clear it. To improve this mode, we can do a few things. I think what needs the biggest overhaul is a Vigor stamina system. What I would recommend is something that Wuthering Waves does. Now, this isn't supposed to be comparing waves at all, but I very much like the way the stamina is handled when it comes to the endgame. The way it works is the higher difficulty, the more points it costs. For example, the lowest cost a stage can have is just 1 being the easiest, and you work your way up to 5 being the hardest. There's actual thought put into when you need to use what character, and you need to think more strategically on character placement. Removing the requirement to run 4 characters might also be a way to help this, but I'm not sure if they would actually do this since it's clear that they want to push for more 14 gameplay. This endgame has a ton of restrictions, and I don't necessarily think restrictions are an inherently bad thing, but when it's restriction on top of restriction on top of restriction, it just doesn't feel good. What they could maybe do is give you a chance to pick units outside of the elemental check. Now they do have the special guest stars, which is something, but they're only a select few. If they wanted to, they could make it so you're able to pick a few characters outside of the elemental check, regardless of who you own. That way you have a little bit of flexibility, instead of being entirely locked to those few units. For those units, they can maybe be a little bit more limited, but having some form of variety would easily make this mode not feel entirely like simply meeting some sort of quota of not having enough units from certain elements. And I've always felt like this mode has next to no replayability. Now you could argue that Spiral Abyss doesn't either because there are no rewards, but at least in that mode you can go in there and try out a bunch of different teams to relative success. That's not the case with this mode. Maybe what they can do is add some sort of tower mode alongside it, where you pick the elements you need and then the stages get increasingly harder. For the Vigor system, add a cooldown between the number of stages you need to complete until you can use your characters again. I really hope this mode does get ironed out more over time, because it still really just feels like a chore. I'm somebody who does the endgame all the time, but sometimes I don't even bother with this mode because it's simply not enjoyable. So I've actually been writing this video for quite a bit, and while I was writing it, Genshin actually released a brand new endgame mode known as Stygian Onslaught. This is mostly just the first impressions, and I'm sure a lot of the criticisms will be addressed in the future. So to give a basic rundown of this mode, instead of 2 teams like Spiral Abyss, you now need 3 teams. You are able to get the stages done in co-op, however you cannot obtain rewards after difficulty 5 in co-op. Now this mode is very hard, which I do love. I actually felt challenged, which I haven't felt for a while. I did have fun trying a bunch of different teams and seeing how well they would do. I would say that difficulty 5 or Fearless mode is if Spiral Abyss had a 13th floor, so it is pretty hard. One of the massive upsides is that you're able to farm artifacts more efficiently and you get bonuses for the first 10 days or so, which I actually think is a very good thing. It gives you an incentive to play the mode and get more artifact drops. The current rotation has 3 bosses, and there are some new mechanics which I do like. For example, the Hydrotolpa has a shield that you need to break. The quality and effectiveness of these mechanics can be called into question though. I am glad they actually changed the bosses a bit, but they are still pretty specific. You are not able to run Hydro, the best element in the game, against 2 out of the 3 chambers, which cuts down a lot of your pretty good team options. And this also means that a very popular and powerful DPS such as New Valette is rendered pretty bad at this mode. The bosses are very tailored toward new units. Characters like Mawika, Kinich, and Skirk will shred this mode with little effort. But the most frustrating part of this mode is that you start with 0 energy. This means that you end up spending 15 to 20 seconds dancing around the boss trying to get your energy back. Elemental bursts are important for about 90% of the roster. Starting with full energy should be the standard. The HP on these bosses makes Honkai Star Rail look like Clown College. They are higher than Spiral Abyss, and the bosses do a lot more damage. The HP difference between difficulty 5 and difficulty 6 is also quite large by comparison. If we take difficulty 4 to difficulty 5, the difference is only about 2 million HP. But if we take difficulty 5 versus difficulty 6, the HP doubles. Let's take the Overseer device as an example. Let's assume you're playing just a clear, so you have a 2-minute timer. In difficulty 5, it has 7.6 million HP. If we divide that by 120 seconds, you would get 63k DPS. In difficulty 6, the HP goes up to 14 million. And if we divide that by 120, we get 124k DPS, which is significantly higher than difficulty 5. And that assumes you are DPSing down the entire time, which will very likely not be the case because of the way certain boss mechanics work. Now this is the way out floor, so I can understand it to an extent, but when the idea of a hard mode can be blown up in like 2 seconds, it feels a bit strange. I think what Genshin was trying to go for was something similar to the holograms from Wuthering Waves, but the reason why those succeed and this doesn't is because the timer is not what you're fighting, it's the enemy itself. That's why things like the timer feel very bad in this mode. And we also need to talk about the elephant in the room, difficulty 6 and the rewards. The artifact reroll feathers are very limited, and the weapon skins actually look very nice. I actually think it's funny that there's a Hydro Claymore skin, but there's no Hydro Claymore character. You need to beat the hardest difficulty in order to receive the 4-star skin. And for the 5-star skin, a more glowy version of it, you need to be able to clear it within 180 seconds. Now, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I don't think making whale content is necessarily a bad thing. However, I'm not a fan of the weapon skins being locked behind dire difficulty. I think it would have made more sense if they put the skins behind difficulty 5, since that is more difficult than the Spiral Abyss, and you already need a lot more optimization and sweaty gameplay if you aren't playing the units directly shielded for it. And to add insult to injury, the skins aren't even permanent. They will be taken away from you on the next Stygian rotation. To be honest, I think it's fine that the whales have their side of the children's playground. My issue is the fact that the bosses are so shielded that even if you are a whale, now you need to hope you wailed on a specific character in order to be able to use them effectively in this mode. I'll use myself as an example. I am not free to play. I could probably be considered a whale at this point. I have a C6 Skirk, and she just completely destroys the automaton. But I also have a C6 Hu Tao, and I want to focus on that for this. Her C6 states, triggers when Hu Tao's HP drops below 25%, or when she suffers a lethal strike. Hu Tao will not fall as a result of the damage sustained. A lethal strike? Like the Hydro Tulpa if you don't break the shield? So you would expect C6 Hu Tao to proc, right? Well, nope. You can see the HP tick down to 1, but you'll still get one-shotted. She can indeed break the shield normally, but not having your C6 be used just doesn't feel good at all. My point being, even if somebody owns a C6 character that is simply not as strong or not being shielded, they can still very much struggle if they C6 the wrong character. So with that said, I have some ideas to fix this game mode as a whole. Firstly, instead of 3 set bosses, maybe make some more bosses, around 5 or 6, and allow you to choose what boss you want to fight. That way, even if the bosses want to be shielded to a certain character, you will have a much better chance of owning the character that you need to clear, and giving you some actual roster diversity. For the timer, I would extend it but maybe reduce healing or shielding over time, so you can't simply just stand there and take damage. What they could also do is add something where after a certain amount of time, the boss will do a lot more damage. We actually have something very similar to this in Honkai Star Rail Simulated Universe called Berserk Mode, where after a certain amount of cycles pass, the boss will deal a lot more damage to you. That way, you still have the pressure of clearing fast before the boss can kill you. As for the weapon skins, I don't really see why they aren't permanent. It should be held as a sort of trophy saying that you earned this, but instead it's yanked away from you at the next rotation. They could have simply let them be permanent, and then the only reward from this mode would be the feathers, which are still extremely valuable and something people would still go after. It is weird because we have a very good reward system that doesn't expire, that being the key system in the Imaginarium Theater. You can unlock different trails or echoes for your characters, it's permanent and it works very well. My suggestion would be after you beat difficulty 5, then you get to choose a 4-star weapon skin. If you're able to beat dire difficulty, then you get to pick the 5-star weapon skin. Both of them would not expire. That way, you still keep the incentive to continue playing the mode, and the skins are more realistically achievable and everybody still gets to keep them. Overall, I think this mode has good framework for being a great one, but there's too many glaring flaws for me to say that it's a truly good endgame at the moment. I hope that the glaring problems will be ironed out in the next update. But given how Genshin and good changes barely go together right now, I don't know how long it's going to take to get stuff done. Now before we continue on, I want to take a brief moment to ask you to subscribe. This was definitely a longer video that took countless hours to make, so if you like what you see, please consider liking and subscribing because it really does help me out a lot. But anyways, let's get back to the video. Moving on to Honkai Star Rail, I feel a bit different about the endgame in HSR versus the other games. I remember back in the day, when Genshin was receiving a large amount of criticism about the lack of the endgame, we had Honkai Star Rail come up, that had a promising endgame mode, and was very good for quite a while. Until it started going downhill. Now if you've been following my channel for a long time, you might remember a video I made titled, HP inflation is out of control. Now this video ended up starting a bit of an uproar for the next 2 weeks about the general trend of HP inflation in Honkai Star Rail's endgame, and it really hasn't slowed down since. If you look at the HP trends, you can actually correlate the HP increases to the release of certain characters, showing that the HP bloat is used to compensate for the high damage ceiling. I talked about this a little bit in my Akron video, which you should definitely go watch, that HP inflation will typically occur when the older bosses return to the endgame modes, and those bosses are simply outdated. The lack of either self-damaging or another sort of gimmick results in a pretty unfun experience of just beating up a punching bag. Especially in the current 3.3 MOC, being Hule and the True Sting, Both have pretty high HP and feel very outdated. It's part of the reason they had to buff old characters because they literally could not clear without the newest units. We also need to talk about the buffs in the endgame. Now it's clear that the endgame modes are basically always tailored to new characters, which in of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem I have is when buffs are very limited, and don't let other characters take advantage of them. As an example, let's take the Memory of Chaos in 3.1. This MOC had a buff to max HP. Okay, well, how many HP scaling DPSs did we have? 2. When an ally consumed HP, they would also restore some HP. So how many characters can drain HP? Well, out of the entire roster, we really didn't have that many. Only 2 of these characters directly scale off of HP. There was also a lesser known strategy of synergizing Jiggly's HP drain with the buff in order to easily play Sustainless. But other than that, the buff really doesn't help anybody else. I am not a fan of these buffs being so hyper specific. And speaking of the turbulence, the damage is laughably terrible. I'm sure if you threw a snowball at the enemy, it would do more damage. For the actual bosses themselves, it's a very mixed bag. We have some very good boss designs where you're required to interact with a certain boss gimmick in order to do well. For example, a boss like Aventurine, while being a more annoying boss, does indeed force you to actually deal with the dice. We have bosses like Hule, who I can acknowledge has a good design despite me not being the biggest fan of his MOC variant. Pretty often we will have bosses that are made to directly prop up a character. Allowing a character to excel in a certain boss is not a new concept, but it has gotten increasingly more noticeable. Let's run through some of the enemies and the characters they're associated with. Dill and Jingliu, True Sting, Argenti, Memory Zone Meme, Black Swan, Aventurine Boss, Acheron, Soda Monkey, Aventurine, Past, Present, and the Eternal Show, Firefly, Hule, Yunli and Fei Xiao, Banana Research Group, Rappa, Flame Reaver, the Herda, sort of? And the main one I wanted to talk about was Pollux and Castorus. This is the most shield boss we have ever had in the game. If you wanted to clear this fight fast in 0 to 1 cycle, Castorus made that an absolute joke. I watch these clears and I can't help but want to laugh at how absurdly tailored this boss is. I think the design of this fight is actually pretty cool. While being harder to 0 cycle for anyone not named Castorus, it is a pretty easy fight as long as you bring a healer. The bosses in the past were indeed chilled to an extent, but the reason why it wasn't felt as hard is because the damage floor and ceiling were significantly lower than what they are now. In a turn-based game, emphasis needs to be placed much more on your enemies because your characters at a base can only do so much. And I feel that especially in 3.x, the increasingly more aggressive boss designs towards new units has made the game feel less fun. And when bosses return to the endgame modes, they might have good designs, but when few characters can interact meaningfully with a boss, then does it even matter? So why did all of this happen? I think the answer is pretty clear. They want to sell new characters, and given that HSR has next to no complexity, raising HP and damage is the only way that they deem possible to increase difficulty. It's also pretty clear that they're trying to kill 0 cycles and keeping them a premium experience. If you notice, a lot of the MOC blessings trigger first cycle, meaning that somebody who is trying to 0 cycle cannot take advantage of those buffs. I really don't think this mode needs too much work to be effective content, so I propose a few fixes. First of all, let us select a buff instead of being given a random turbulence. If they don't want to get rid of the very hard shield buffs, then what they can do is let us pick a smaller buff on top of it. Both of the other modes allow you to select a buff that fits your team better, so I see no reason why MOC shouldn't give you buffs that still benefit your team, even if it's small. And second, try to make the bosses more interesting. We've clearly seen they have the ability to make it happen, and yet the boss from literally the launch of the game is still often showing up in endgame, but just with more HP. For example, make Svarog spawn 2 hands instead of 1. We clearly know that they have the ability to do this because it's what his boss does in Golden Gears. Maybe after you break them, then Svarog takes damage or gets all of his resistance produced or something. When we have these bosses that don't evolve with the current endgame lineup, then the HP spikes become increasingly more noticeable. I will give them credit as the new bosses are a lot more unique than what we had in the past, but old bosses should be adjusted accordingly when showing up in the newer content. We also have 2 other game modes, Pure Fiction and Apocalyptic Shadow. Starting off with Pure Fiction, I've noticed that people's perception of this mode is entirely dependent on whether or not they own the Herda, who just completely destroys that mode with 0 effort, and somebody like myself who does not own the Herda, it feels a lot worse. I really do like how you can choose the buffs you want in order to better suit your team, and we have been getting more DPSs who are very solid in AoE as well, who do good in this game mode. After it got a large rework in version 2.7, I actually don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with this mode, other than the fact that the buffs can sometimes be incredibly inconsistent. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, and sometimes they're for DOT. But when they are stronger, they are actually quite good. There's honestly not much to say about Pure Fiction. It serves its role as an AoE mode pretty well. Moving on to Apocalyptic Shadow, this is my favorite mode in the game. You still pick 2 teams of 4 as always, but you get to select a buff that helps you. This is a mode very heavily focused around you breaking the toughness bar to get massive buffs and kill the boss, but that doesn't mean super break is the only thing that's viable. The bosses are very unique and have interesting mechanics. I love that. For example, Hule has a completely new mechanic. You select one character to go solo and you duel Hule, and you get multiple turns to break his toughness bar. When I say I want unique and fun mechanics, this is exactly what I mean. Even the other bosses like Aventurine keep spawning dice for you to kill, and that's what frustrates me about MOC. We clearly see that Hoyoverse has the ability to add interesting and fun mechanics in these game modes, but we're still using bosses from 1.0. I think the only thing I don't like about this mode is the fact that sometimes there are not at least one boss with each weakness. Like sometimes there'll be a rotation that neither boss is weak to ice, so ice characters had a very rough time or just couldn't clear at all. I feel like since you have 7 elements, and each boss has 4 weaknesses, each boss should have a weakness of each element at least once. I think what bothers me about Honkai Star Rail's endgame in general is the lack of variety. This is mostly an issue at the beginning of 3.x, where the entire endgame was AoE, not just pure fiction. So was MOC, and so was Apocalyptic Shadow. This was clearly due to the newer AoE characters like the Herda. And especially what bothers me about that is that 2 of the characters rerunning in 3.0 were single target DPSs in an AoE format across the board. So if you wanted to pull them or play them, then you might have had a bit of an annoying time trying to do so. Apocalyptic Shadow was a mode built up to be a boss mode, where mostly single target units can shine, but over time that was no longer the case. Different modes can fulfill different purposes. They don't all need to be glorified pure fiction, it's good to have some variety. And especially with more recent characters such as Archer, who is free, now more than ever it's important to have areas where AoE characters can shine, single target characters can shine, and blast characters can shine. And I'm glad that more recently, it seems like they've been doing a better job with this. Overall, Honkai Star Rail does have the resources and ability to make endgame more fun, and honestly, this is probably the game I want to have better endgame the most. Given that there isn't much to do in the game to begin with, and it's a game very much focused on its combat to sell new characters, I think that this should have the best endgame out of all the Hoyoverse games. Okay, so while I was finishing up editing this video, a new game mode was announced called Anomaly Arbitration. This mode actually sounds very interesting. In order to unlock this mode, you need a complete Memory of Chaos, Pure Fiction, and Apocalyptic Shadow with max stars, so it's clear that this will be a very end-to-end game mode. For the first 3 floors, you will need 3 separate teams, and then on the final stage, you only need 1 team and can use whatever you want. In this mode, you'll have the chance to get leveling materials, limited time avatar frame, and even some cosmetics. We don't know what these cosmetics are going to be, but I think the most likely answer is character skins, because trust me, if we have to grind this mode and the reward is a pom-pom skin, I don't think many people would be thrilled. I hope that the HSR devs took notes of game modes like Stygian Onslaught and are working to make a fun and engaging game mode. The 3 teams have been highly requested over time and could make for a very interesting experience. I have faith that this can be a great game mode, but we're just gonna have to wait and see. And finally, we have Zenless Zone Zero. Now let me preface by saying this is the game I play the least by far. I don't think the game is bad at all. Some of the characters actually look very nice, but if I wanted to look at them, I would just go on Pixiv. What actually keeps me coming back to the game is the endgame content. I did not expect the Ass Juggle Gunnerslab game to have the best endgame content out of the 3 games, but here we are. Shio Defense is very similar to Spiral Abyss or Memory of Chaos, but I actually enjoyed it a decent bit more than that. Now granted, maybe I'm too Miyabi-pilled, but I find this kind of fun, especially because a lot of the bosses feel unique compared to the others. And I mean that gameplay wise and not visual wise because I don't want to fight Ethereal number 72. Now there has been a lot of conversation around HP inflation and how that can become a large issue for the game, and I'm inclined to agree. Let's just be honest, Miyabi, Astra, the Decibel system are indeed raising the damage ceiling, and as much as people want to deny it, there is indeed power creep in Zenless. I mean, why did Ellen get buffed? Now obviously HP inflation is occurring, and that's undeniable, but I also think it's important to recognize that we as players have gotten more power as well. A lot of the new DPSs are simply stronger now. We've also been getting frequent indirect buffs using new disk drives and new characters. The game has absolutely gone up in difficulty, but we have also grown alongside it, although it may not be exactly of equal value. I think this conversation is a little bit more nuanced than people make it out to be. In Zenless, you have 2 main routes in order to clear content effectively. The first one is pulling the newer characters and clearing very easily. If you were to pull one of the very strong units like Miyabi or Astra Yao, they will take what was initially a harder stage and make it significantly easier because they are simply that strong. The other option is to take more time into building up your current roster and try to get away with playing better or higher investment. In a game like Zenless, which is a pretty skill intensive game, you can make up for having bad units by playing better or taking advantages of things like enemy weaknesses or stage buffs. Just because HP inflation occurs does not mean you can't clear with the older roster. Inversely, just because you can clear with the old roster does not mean HP inflation isn't occurring. I hope that the devs are taking HP into consideration when designing their endgame, because we've seen what it ends up doing to both the other Hoyo games. I do agree that HP rising is needed to some degree when you still need to meaningfully engage with the game. Things like stage buffs, boss design, the time limit, and the current state of power should all be factors put in order to make a good mode. Back when Zenless first came out, the game was way too freaking easy, so they had to make it harder. However, I believe the community, alongside calculating how much milk Nicole can produce, should be having the conversation about the HP trajectory, because if they don't, we know exactly how this is going to go. Deny the problem is happening, let it build up until it reaches a breaking point, the community gets pissed off, and now no one is happy. And the lack of acknowledgement is what got us into situations back in HSR where it's simply being ignored. It will fare better than HSR because there's actual skill involved in this game, but we should still talk about these issues before we have 40 million HP bosses. Personally, what I think is worse than HP inflation when it comes to Zenless is how much invincibility some of the bosses have. You can't damage them for 5 to 10 seconds, and you're just sitting there waiting for them to do something. The animations are quite long, and it just feels like a stall mechanic more than anything. Just having a boss ability where they do a certain thing is not a problem. There are many games that have done that before, and it's handled pretty well for the most part. But when you put a timer on top of it, then that's where it doesn't feel that great. If they're going to make bosses like that, they should not have invincibility windows that are that long. And while we're talking about Endgame, I think I might as well talk about the miasma shield. This was a large controversy back when 2.0 dropped, with content creators talking about it, and then smaller Zenless channels making videos on those content creators. First, I need to explain the way the miasma shield works. At a certain point in the fight, a boss will gain a miasma shield and take less damage. You need to use dodge counters, defensive assists, or your ultimates. Once you break the shield, it does damage to the boss as well as giving you some energy back. Nobody can ignore miasma. The reason a character like Yishuan can deal with it better is because being a rupture agent lets her ignore defense. So I'll just say my piece on it now. I'm kind of mixed on it. It's very similar to the Night Soul shield from Genshin. It has absolutely made this chill Yishuan because she ignores defense, but other characters can still deal with it pretty well. I think it's good that that is the case because it's more interactive, and while having an easier solution available in Yishuan, you don't need her in order to clear. I think it's a good thing to add more direct mechanics that force you to actually tackle the boss head on, although sometimes it can feel a little bit stally. However, I am also a bit cautious of this precedent because we've seen how more tailored mechanics have ended up in the past games, but if it's a more temporary thing, then it shouldn't be a massive deal. But I will say, there should be more restrictions when it comes to these mechanics. For example, I don't really think it should trigger more than one time in a fight. A fight that you can feel this in is Miasma Jane. She has one phase of Miasma around a minute into the fight. Not a super big deal, pretty manageable. But she also gets a second phase of Miasma around the 220 mark, and if you take that long, then it's not going to feel that great. If this is just a temporary thing to show off Yishuan or something, then I am willing to let it slide. Does it make or break the game for me? No. But I can't say with 100% certainty that I like where this is going. On a more positive note, something that I really like about Zenless Endgame is the amount of creativity and optimization you can have. Now there is the label of being a button mash simulator, and you can probably get pretty far by doing so, but there is some more to the combat. I'll use myself as an example. I don't worry about logging in daily, I hardly play Hollow Zero, and I would mostly only play for the endgame. And I'll be straight up and say that I'm not very good at the game. I understand the game decently well, but I'm not negative edging or anything. But I am when I see Yishuan. When I consistently played, I would have no issue clearing Shiyu defense. When I came back a bit later and tried it again, I had noticed the endgame had indeed gotten harder. I was lucky enough on pulling Yuzuha and used my leftover battery to build her and Vivian up as much as I could, which really was not that much. With that super low investment, I was barely able to squeeze out a clear. Now some may look at that and see massive skill issue or even a poorly designed game mode, and both could be true. But at the same time, I always knew in the back of my head that I could do better through different ways. I wasn't playing into the enemy weakness, so I brought my Jane Doe back and was even able to get a clear with her faster. All the runs that I did took a few tries, and that's fine. This is supposed to be some of the hardest content after all. After playing some more, I felt like Miyabi was carrying me a bit too hard, so I decided I would try to clear without her. Now if you don't know, my favorite characters in Zenless are Evelyn and Lighter, and luckily they are both pretty good on a team together. Evelyn is definitely a harder character to play, and since the endgame did get harder, I had to learn to play her better, and let me tell you, those chain attacks are very fun. And when I was able to clear, I felt satisfied because it felt like an obstacle I had to overcome. And since I had to put more effort into clear, I was happy with it. Was it the most optimized clear in the world? Definitely not. There was absolutely some more I can improve on, but it still felt like a challenge. And if Hoyo wants to design an endgame around you needing to take more advantage with the fundamental mechanics of the game to a large degree, then I don't really see a problem with that. Now obviously it should still be within reason, and not have a mess of stall mechanics and other bullshit, but I think having to engage with the game more is fine, especially in a game with a lot of room for more advanced gameplay. Player agency and room for optimization is something I value very heavily in games, and Zenless has a lot of that. If you go onto YouTube right now, you can see so many people running a lot of different teams to clear content. And while I don't think the ability to still clear is an indicator of a game mode having no flaws, I think it's important to acknowledge that you have quite a bit you can do in order to improve your clear time. I would say that Zenless has the most freedom out of any Hoyo game when it comes to that, since you aren't really hard stuck in playing a certain archetype or reaction. It's certainly a step up from other game modes, and it's great that Zenless has a pretty nice amount of variety. But the really good endgame mode of Zenless is actually the smaller mode, Deadly Assault, and this is probably my favorite endgame mode in all of Hoyoverse. You need 3 teams of 3 and you get to select a buff of your choice. Instead of having to defeat the boss has stacking health bars you have to deal with. You have 3 minutes, and the more damage you do, the more points you get, and you need 20,000 points to get 3 stars. But doing damage isn't the only way that you can get points. Each boss has different ways you can get more points. For example, triggering a perfect assist on Pompeii will give you 350 points. It is technically a bullet sponge since it doesn't die, but it actually has a bit more depth to it. And with Zenless being an action game, there is much more room for that. If you want to get the max polychrome reward, you only need to get 6 out of 9 stars, so max clearing 2 bosses. So if there's a boss you aren't equipped to deal with, or you just don't want to fight, then you don't have to. Now, I won't glaze this mode to the moon, it does have a couple flaws. Some of the bosses are cool, but once again very shilled, like Bringer where you play Miyabi and you just win. While the mechanics are unique for sure, they can sometimes feel a bit out of place. For example, the Miasmic Fiend has a little mini game that you need to play. You need to line up the circle on the miasma pools in order to break them. When I first fought it, I was very surprised, but I felt like I was playing a party game instead of an action game. It is somewhat remedied by the fact that you can still get Deadly Assault points, but it might not be something everybody enjoys. This mode is what Stygian Onslaught in Genshin should have been. A cool mode with some bosses, while also having some cool mechanics to get more points throughout the fight. I'm not even the biggest Zenless guy. I only play this game for the plot, but I still log in and play the endgame because I just really enjoy it. It's obvious not perfect, but I think the other Hoyo games should learn from Zenless. And on top of all this, Zenless actually has a faster reset time for their endgame compared to the other Hoyo games. Instead of on a 2-week rotation or twice a month, it actually alternates weekly between Shiyu Defense and Deadly Assault. Now the rewards are significantly lower on Deadly Assault compared to Shiyu Defense, so I'm not sure if any of the scheduling on the endgame and the other games would change, besides maybe Stygian Onslaught. Both modes have pretty good replayability as well. You have a good amount of creativity with teams and such, especially inside of Shiyu Defense, since the power creep is not that big of a problem yet. I'm still very cautious of this game because we know what happens the second another Hoyo game comes out, but if they continue to have enjoyable content, then I actually think I would consider playing this game a lot more often. I also want to talk about the general perception towards endgame content. From what I've seen, the general consensus is that it's an optional mode that is made to be some of the hardest content, and that's true to an extent. But it is also clear that they want you to try these modes. Every patch, a certain amount of currency is allocated to resetting in-game modes. If we take 5.7's poll count, it estimates 57 polls. If we remove endgame from the equation, we would get 47 polls, so quite a bit less. And realistically, if you're trying to build your characters very well, then that's what you're building them up for. The story is easy enough, most of the time, to the point where high investment or insane artifacts aren't needed, and the place where you'll be truly putting these characters to the test is within these endgame experiences. Sometimes I feel like there's a large disconnect between what Hoyoverse is designing and how we as players end up consuming it. I feel it would be a fair statement to say that when they design and test content, it's very likely they don't play the same way we do, or exploit certain mechanics. That led to the popular belief back in 3.0 of Honkai Star Rail that the devs were not playing their own game.
What this is referring to is the Chinese people believe that the devs themselves are not playing the game.
The truth is, they probably do test content, but are they doing it with every character, or even sustainless? Probably not. Attempting to get rid of zero cycling has led to weaker buffs and massive HP inflation. At the end of the day, these are still gacha games, and in these games, it is indeed difficult to make meaningful content for players to test their skills, especially when things like whales exist. You can't make everybody happy, so you need to make the most people happy. And to do that, they really need to focus on who is actually playing the mode and adjust it accordingly. We don't have actual data, so I will not make an arbitrary number of people playing endgame, but it's quite obvious that the overwhelming majority of people who have thoughts on the endgame content are the ones playing it. And I would say that Hoyoverse needs to design their content with that player in mind. Seemingly what they're trying to do now is make Spiral Abyss a way to get into harder content and then locking the true challenges behind a mode like Stygian Onslaught. In reality, there should be more emphasis on endgame content. These games are not cheap, characters can cost you hundreds of dollars. People are well within their right to want more meaningful content out of the characters they spend so much time or money on. When you're leveling up and building teams, endgame and harder content is really the only place you're using them in. But when there are criticisms towards endgame content, whether it be constructive or deconstructive, usually a common counterpoint is, you don't have to play endgame, it's only a small amount of currency, and let me break my silence and say that this is not a good argument. If the solution to fix the endgame mode is to not play the mode, then that's more telling than people realize. Just because we have harder content in Genshin now, doesn't mean that people aren't allowed to criticize it. Stygian Onslaught would be good on paper if it was well designed. However, I think that there are indeed some good modes like Apocalyptic Shadow and Deadly Assault that are pretty well designed for the most part. It's actually sort of sad how fast people will turn on a content creator the minute they say they don't like something. If the game needs fixing, then people who don't have Dawei sliding money under the table are going to talk about it, and that's just how it is. I'll be straight up and say that in the past, I've not done the best job of criticizing things well, and I acknowledge that. And I've worked on improving that, and I hope that that has been reflected in my newer videos. People might like the modes, people might dislike the modes, and when we have the ability to critically think, then maybe we can see future improvements for all these modes, and have more fun, engaging content that people would want to grind for. Now before I close out this video, I want to say thank you so much for 10,000 subscribers. I've only been doing content for less than a year now, and to have that already is crazy. I do everything on my own, whether it be scripting, recording, editing, all that, and it takes a ton of time. I know my upload schedule has not been the best, but I promise you, things are still coming. If you have any suggestions for what I should do to celebrate, let me know, because honestly, I don't really have any ideas. If you made it to the end, I appreciate you sticking around. This was one of my longest videos, so if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing so I can feed my family. If you want a place to come chat, then consider joining the Discord down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.